It is wonderful to be able to introduce to you Sanjee Perera this morning. Actually, I have to admit, I only first met Sanjee in June when Archbishop Stephen Cottrell said to me, we should have Sanjee on a consultation group we were putting together, working on the vision and strategy of the Church of England over the next 10 years. And working with Sanjee, I quickly realized actually why she was such a great choice. And as soon as we were doing this conference, I knew we had to get her speaking. I could be telling you she's a leading academic. I could be telling you she's a cognitive psychologist. I could be telling you she's an ecclesiologist as well. That at the moment she's based at Coventry University, that she's written lots of papers. I could tell you she's worked on the Minority Anglicanism project, looking at race, prejudice, and marginalization. But from my experience of working with Sanjee, what I want to say to you is, this is a person who loves Jesus and loves talking about Jesus, and that I think she is a prophet for and to the church. So I want to ask you to listen up, and as Jill Duff said, to fill your boots, because I think over the next half an hour, 40 minutes, we're going to be challenged by Sanjee about what it means to be truly welcoming as a church and to be receptive to everyone in our communities. So Sanjee, we're looking forward to this, and over to you.
For your kind invitation and that very generous introduction. And let me say what a privilege it is to join you all at this year's Evangelism and Discipleship Conference. I'm a little overwhelmed to be addressing you amongst such august personages. Since Dave covered what I do, I'll start off saying hello and thank you for the opportunity. Many of you here today, I imagine, are clergy or missioners in an anointed capacity in so-called professional Christian ministry. For many of you, it's your day job, a role that you have spent many years training for and have more than one theological degree in. You might wonder what the cognitive psychologist masquerading as an ecclesiologist might have to offer your years of experience and study. Well, I've been wondering that myself. You'll have to ask Dave what in the world possessed him to invite me. In the meantime, I'd like to offer you a glimpse of the view from the vulnerable margins, from the uncomfortable pews of the disenfranchised, and offer some diagnostic insights arising from the various psychosocial investigations in Anglican ecclesiology and missiology on how, despite the best efforts of your intentions, what you think are the most welcoming, hospitable Christian spaces can become hostile and debilitating places for the vulnerable, where real psychological damage can occur. And it is more important than ever just now to be vigilant of this damage. In a fragile world that is experiencing extraordinary and catalyst change, the church is asking, what can we do? How can we be better? I get a lot of emails asking me this. How can we do race better in the church? It is a time when people are fearful, and for the first time in a long time, this generation is looking for something bigger than their petty everyday concerns. The world is experiencing an existentialist crisis, this enlightened generation that thought it was invincible, immortal, that thought they didn't need the crutch of religion, that made altars to commerce and industry and science. There they are, whimpering and hungry, cowering and afraid, waiting. And there you are, ready to go tell, to evangelize and make disciples of the world. But before you do, I'd like to ask you, why? Why do you want to share the good news? Is it because it's your job, what you were trained for, what you have always done? Has it become some sort of default mechanism? Or is it because you know better? Is it because you have found something extraordinary that you're eager to tell the world about? Is it because your spirituality is deeper and greater? Is it because your light is brighter? Is it because you feel superior? because you believe you are the gatekeepers to God's grace? Is it because you believe you have been anointed to speak for God? I hope you ask yourselves why you do what you do often. And I hope the answer is found at the foot of the cross. Recently, the Archbishop of Canterbury asked, is Christian evangelism and discipleship good news for everyone? And here's where my own cognitive dissonance comes limping in. Even though I'm sincerely invested in the missiology of the Anglican Church, I know that it is not. I know that our good intentions doesn't always secure the fruitfulness of the kingdom. The findings of the Minority Anglicanism Project overwhelmed me. Its evidence suggested that if you were a person of colour or from a variety of other marginalised demographics, be it sexuality, disability, immigration status, or gender transformation, you were likely to present indicators of de-individuation, identity distress, and other forms of cognitive dissonance in ecclesiastical spaces, primed in and by church. I found this research evidence really difficult to write up. My scientific objectivity abandoned me, and I was filled with a cold despair. I don't know why I'm surprised. What did I expect? Almost every Black theologian, academic, and activist, every ability and queer theologian I spoke to asked me, why was I surprised? How could I have been naive enough to expect anything else? Nevertheless, the results punched me in the stomach. A prominent Black theologian and a great friend said to me, knowing all that you know about the history of Anglicanism and the Church of England, if you still choose to be a part of it, you're part of the problem. I found that really hard. As a cradle Anglican, it was devastating. I was overwhelmed by despair I can't quite explain to my white colleagues, a despair I'm not sure many of you here today can grasp or even take seriously. So you might ask, firstly, what is the problem? Or in scientific terms, what are the causal conditions? And what do we do? I don't believe in ready-made solutions or grand theories, but here are some thoughts. In our interview studies, we consulted the expertise and wisdom of minority ethnic clergy, ordinands, and laity with significant ecclesiastical responsibility and expertise. And their overwhelming conclusion was that there was a deficit in our embodied theology, the gap between orthodoxy and orthopraxy. And I might add, it is the consequences of the fallen nature of human desire and the consequences of leaning too much on our own nature, on a cultural Christianity, rather than in a living presence. Of course, these metaphysical ideas are easy for me to sprout, and as most philosophers, theologians, and other academics do. But how does this manifest in a lived reality? Last summer, I was invited to offer some thoughts on justice in a closing plenary at the Theological Educators Conference. And I'll share some of that with you. I have no doubt we teach our ordinance good theology. I have no doubt you here today, reimagining this disastrous year, have all been schooled in the best of our august theological colleges, read the most insightful theological tomes, and been inspired and invigorated by the most lucid and charismatic theological speakers. But I wonder whether you know the disastrous consequences of bad theology, of distorting the gospel to your own ends, of making a podium of the scriptures and hurling those sacred tablets to confound otherness, or to remake those who do not look or sound or behave like you in your image, making idols of your own shadow. I wonder whether you know the consequences of your lived, embodied theology. If we speak about a God of justice, but cling to the injustices of the world, who will believe us? The disenfranchised and marginalized might ask the church, because you have power, because you have never really gone without, because you have no interest in changing a world that suits you so well, How can we believe in a church working towards a coming salvific, just kingdom? If the kingdom feeds the hungry and sends the rich empty away, did you really want the kingdom to come? If we are not active agents willing justice as we pray, thy kingdom come, willing a transformed world, will the hungry believe we want a world where no one goes without? Will the vulnerable and marginalized want to remain in the seeming hypocrisy of a Sunday matinee of an elite members-only thespian guild? You see why we measured cognitive dissonance in our research? Because this is the opposite of all we have tried to achieve as a church. This is the opposite of all we say we do. And the dissonance between what we set out to do and often what happens due to human fallibility is a painful, fathomless sea. You might say, we try our very best not to be sexist, racist, homophobic, or ableist. And we have an equality statement on our website that tells everyone we're not prejudiced. So how do we do this? How did this come about? Isn't that what we always say when abuses happen in the church? We put every safeguard in place, so it shouldn't happen. But it does. Often because we are broken and human, living out the distorted mirages, because we are inattentive, because we are drowning in systemic pain, confounded in ignorance, living out our mortal broken lives in this fallen Eden, and yet called to liberate God's people. I often wonder whether this licensed and authorized calling of these franchise churches and its tense yet collaborative righteous theology drives us to create impossible caricatured supermen and superwomen who must always get it right, who must always have the answers, who must always speak for God. How do you disciple in this age of instant gratification served by Google and Siri, where often society finds you irrelevant? How do we invite God's people to a perilous adventure, a fellowship of the vulnerable, ignoble? We, who are the apologetic tribe, blemished in scandal and ignominy. We who are always in the danger of falling into the enticements of feel-good ceremonials or problem-solving consumer church experiences. I hope you grasp the difference between sharing the good news and speaking for God or providing some sort of spiritual fix. I find that both clergy and laity who are invested in more in mission and discipleship broadly fall into two categories. Those who think evangelization is a theological exegesis and doctrine, a key discipline of discipleship, and those who value the learning from life experience and claim inspiration in the divine moment. The tension and balance between these are not easy to manage, I imagine. But evangelism is not a technique. Discipleship cannot be pinned down by key point indicators in a mission strategy, though we try. As an academic, I can't tell you how tempting it is for me to put my findings into the nice redacted tables and missiological models. And if you read some of my publications, you may find I have done just that. Forgive me, I'm human, worse. I'm an academic and lean too much on my own understanding, on the fabric of evidence, on tangible constructs we can formulate and revise. It's a very human crutch. So how can we share the good news? Not so much as some sort of research finding that we can claim authorship to, or as a doctrinal curriculum that we're imposing on our flock, but as a journey and an awakening. Sharing the good news was never about lucid content. The divine intervention came in a vulnerable scandal, in love wrapped in a broken body. Because humanity couldn't be transformed by the stone tablets in its nice, simple tick list of 10 strategic objectives. So you might ask again, what are the problems identified by these ecclesiological diagnostics you speak of? Where do we go wrong? How do we damage people? To answer that, I might need more than 50 minutes, so you might have to read some of the papers published on the subject. But let me give you a glimpse of some of the root causes. Particularly in the Church of England, we sometimes have a limited authoritative, monological grasp of how we evangelize. We're shaped by subliminal images we have of discipleship and evangelization. We often have that image of Christ giving the Sermon on the Mount, where a reverent and receptive multitude sit quietly listening, captivated by his grace. Can you see it in your mind's eye, that pastoral scene in stained glass? The serene crowd, the muted sheep sitting by the master, all of creation subject to the voice of the divine human. And if you've seen Victorian stained glass images of overseas mission with white missionaries similarly imitating Christ, all of the world's cultures and kingdoms at their feet, this becomes even more problematic. Part of the problem is that in our desire to imitate Christ and in operating a cliched caricature of what would Jesus do, we appropriate his lordship. As Jennifer Harvey advocates, perhaps we need to relocate ourselves and imitate his humility and receptivity rather than usurp his authority. I'd recommend Al Barrett's excellent book published recently by SCM Press, Interrupting the Church's Flow, where he expands on the idea that we should perhaps ask ourselves, what would Zacchaeus do? Or Al and Ruth Harley's book, Being Interrupted, both an excellent antidote to monological missiology. So then, how do we approach this ministry? Who did Jesus choose to share the gospel? It's easy to imagine God called 12 bearded, faithful, solid, hardworking men, tax collectors and fishermen all. But our story is a little bit more nuanced than that. We're often blinded like Saul, double backing on our politics, running away like Jonah, hardened against divine grace and mercy, faithful like Naomi, widowed, bereaved, struggling to reclaim her homeland, exploring the support of lost kin while supporting an adopted family, complicated like Esther, living in disguise, wearing many masks in power intrigues, invisible yet called to transform empires, aging like Simeon and Anna, wizened and waiting at the golden edge of life before the moment is ripe for them to speak those prophetic words. Insecure and self-entitled like Moses, unable to articulate the liberation we're called to bring about, but also unable to abandon the sacred burning bush that has set our world on fire. There's no one-size-fits-all in the Church of England in ministry. It's not a franchise where we guarantee a quality-controlled, symmetrical ministry, though it often feels like it. Yet we do the greatest damage to people as we try to reshape the world in this normative virtue aesthetic, because we imagine that being churchy is the same as awakening to God. Many of us, when we first embark on mission ventures, or as we step out of theological training newly minted in the ecclesiastical promise, or at the beginning of a new church plant or new parish rule, we quite often expect to walk on water like Jesus, but are more likely to near drown like our Episcopal Church Father. Each ministry we're called to do is different from the last, and our calling will evolve as we will. Evangelization is not a technique. Discipleship is not a universal strategy in a world that will continue to fracture and heal in ways we can't imagine. Evangelization and discipleship is an invitation to the holy ground of the other, where the flame of God-breathed life flickers. Take off your shoes and approach with reverence, because this life, this other, is a beloved creation. Approach with slow Sabbath generosity. This is not a drive-through, and you're not paid for by the count of souls. Approach with humility, receptivity, and vulnerability, for they have much to teach you and afford rich insights into the divine grace. Discipleship, when it works against the grain of the God-breathed threads of human souls, in a deficit model, does much damage. What we need is a celebratory asset model that Sam Wells just talked about this morning. In my recent open access 4-part paper that you can access at anglicanism.org, Beyond the Lychgate, which is a culmination of the findings of the various psychosocial and cognitive ecclesiological studies I've recently carried out, I've spelled out the racialized traumas and microaggressions that people experience in church because of this deficit model. Today, I was tempted to go over such a tick list with you, and then realized that I'd be falling into the trap of suggesting that real anti-racism work or real discipleship can be fulfilled by following such a list or paradigm instead of becoming vulnerable to each other. You can't attend that implicit bias training workshop and imagine that it's all done. It's not as simple as that. So much of our prejudice, our tendencies to stereotype, the operationalized implicit biases, and much of the damage we cause people come from the tendency towards a cognitive economy, from a lack of generosity and vulnerability, and the tendency to rush through quantifying our successes and economizing our efforts, expecting receptivity without affording it, speaking without listening, capturing souls without falling in love with them. So how do you prepare to be vulnerable, to create receptive churches, churches that listen, churches that embrace, heal and hold, churches that transform and is a body alive in Christ, as opposed to an outdated ruin from a primitive deontology? It is easy to believe that you are the clerical clan of Levi serving the Holy of Holies, but you are a new tribe, baptized and liberated by a new covenant. You're not a school of scholars performing rituals and following traditions, or initiating candidates to a new lexicon, that an inclusive ecclesiastical language for those who wear that collar or wear those "what would Jesus do" bracelets or stickers. You're not polishing up apprentices to fit into an institutionalized behemoth, though much of the time I'm sure it feels like that's what you're doing. We are rebellious prodigals, hungry for compassion, transformed by grace. We have been hounded by the divine pursuer and will continue to be as we discern our evolving calling and ministry. It's easy to imagine that the Church of England is a franchise fortress tower, but I hope you will remember that our God is an insurgent, confounding high towers, disrupting the uniformity and the hegemony of Babel. I hope you will remember that you are the chorus of the Pentecostal peoples. I hope you remember that church is not an Elysian gateway to heaven, but that you are accomplices of the just shepherd that journeys to hell to redeem the oppressor alongside the oppressor. So you might ask again, how does the church engage with the marginalized, with the disenfranchised, with racism and those affected by it, with the UK minority ethnic community and with the Black Lives Matter phenomenon? What do you do with bishops who take the knee, bringing politics to your doorstep? I'm afraid my response is uncompromising and will discomfort many. Anti-racism work can't begin till you have given your time to understanding the problem, till you have listened with some generosity to things that will disturb you and make you anxious, things that might reshape your narrative and your values. If you're not open to the possibility, the cause is lost before we begin. There are many painful questions about dioceses, churches, congregations, and other ecclesiastical structures we need to ask ourselves. But here are 5 to begin with. Is the church power dynamics a racialized process? Is race, alongside other marginalized intersectional demographics, a factor in the way church manifests itself, both nationally and in your local context? Has historically colonizing patterns and paradigms of manipulating race become the default norm? Has tradition and culture subtly mutated with these oppressive norms? And finally, is this congruous with gospel values and a Christ-centered missiology? We can ask similar questions along the lines of other prejudices too. If you're really interested, I would strongly recommend the writings, lectures, and podcasts of academics, theologians, and clergy activists like James Cone, Anthony Reddy, Robert Beckford, Rasa Sugitharaja, Renieto Lodge, Kelly Brown Douglas, Nikesh Shukla, Azariah Francis Williams, and Ben Lindsay. Of course, the greatest challenges to recognizing the nature of racism in everyday culture, consciously or subconsciously, is the desire to hold on to the privileges that might inequitably benefit us. Conflicting with the very human desire to believe that we're a part of a just and meritocratic society, a just and meritocratic church. To accept that we might be the beneficiaries of a corrupt, predatory system creates anxiety and requires us to either reject or accept these accusations in varying degrees of complexity. So if we belong to a demographic group that benefits and are empowered by this racialized status quo, a resilient and blinkered defense mechanism often filters judgment on how we perceive and narrate the past and judge the present. Psychological theory suggests that if you enjoy a position of power, you have a comfortable life, you might not see the woods for the trees, that you might imagine that racism is a deviant reality, it's not the norm. One that groups like the BLM movement might overplay. Some of my closest friends say things like, it's an American problem. That's not relevant here. I'm uncomfortable of the Marxist turbulence it has brought to our doorstep. I'm confident that many of you here today believe this too. And people like me, as our research data evidence, are frozen in an overwhelming despair, in a cognitive dissonance in grasping this reality. How can people we love that are a part of our church family not see the storm of microaggression we walk through the moment we pass the Lychgate as we approach the altar? Can you imagine how painful it is to know that our church family don't really see our color, don't really see beyond our color, and infantilize and diminish us, and see the deficit version of ourselves because they don't embrace us as entirely human or see us as their equal? Cultural theorists locate these discrepancies of perception to identity defensive ideologies that spring from a sense of being personally attacked when racialized power structures are critiqued. Power is an insidious thing. So many of us do not imagine we have its entitlements. We only notice its gaps, those small spaces where we have been denied it. Power is an insidious thing. The more you have, the more you want, the more you will work to consolidate and grasp it. Psychological research suggests that the more power you have, the less capable you are of perspective taking, of empathy. Remember the camel coming through the eye of the needle? Surrendering control is very hard for us because we are a fallen creation. Cognitive and psychosocial models of behavioral economy would predict unfavorable odds against the Church of England's capacity to make significant and sustainable change for all its performative repentance. The structural, cultural, and behavioral challenges in this establishment steeped in tradition, privilege, and power, overburdened with such a racialized heritage and deontology, seem impossible odds to overcome. In short, the science suggests that the church will never change. But I may have trained as a psychologist, but I'm a closet theologian, and I believe in the impossible. If you belong to the school of thought that the justice issues of the world should not cross the Lychgate, that the church's apology and the performative allyship of the bishops were a a frantic self-abasement by the white middle class as a part of their great awakening, we're back at square one. I often talk about the power of performative liturgy. Liturgy is an invitation from the heart of our communion. It is an act of penitence. It's an invitation to a generous belonging. For me, this year's synod pronouncements and the BLM responses by the bishops were some of the most powerful acts of liturgy I had ever heard from the Church of England. Those acts did more for the church and the world in invitation and reconciliation with UK minority ethnic people and the former colonies than decades of charismatic speakers. Remember, Jesus didn't just sermonize about justice. He overturned tables, dined with prostitutes and tax collectors, asked to drink from the Samaritan woman's jug. Those were acts of a performative liturgy. It told us who he was, what belonging to him and to the kingdom might mean, what this divine communion was all about. Of course, if we stop at repentance, we have achieved very little. It was simply pandering to a culture war, a just token to appease the masses, an empty gesture, as many cynics would have you believe. It comes to nothing. Perhaps I'm being naive again, but I'm a fool for hope and for the best God-breathed possibility of human nature and all that a divine dunamis calls the church to do. With repentance needs come transformation. And some of what I have published are the more mundane practical guidelines in what needs to change. But don't for a moment presume that what I offer is a mission program of anti-racism strategy. Because without a real understanding of the issues, without a real acknowledgement of the problems, without a real desire to change, without real love for your brothers and sisters in Christ, it will be an empty clanging bell. It will achieve nothing. One of the things I was not prepared for when I started the Minority Anglicanism project was all the fan mail it created. Of course, when you contact a couple of thousand parishes, clergy, laity in the Church of England, you should expect some of them to write back. A significant amount of it was trolling, both on social media, email, and snail mail. Some of it criticized the endeavor. The Church of England didn't have a race issue. Why were we wasting everyone's time with this? Where was all the money coming from? Why were we ontologizing race? But most of it was lamentation. Stories of people broken by church, othered by church, oppressed by church. Heartbreaking stories, mostly from the minority ethnic community, but also from the LGBTQI and disabled communities, or people who had been abused by church. These stories increased my despair. So much so I thought, this is not a psychologically healthy space to work in. I need something more emotionally stable and neutral to work with. So I applied to return to the safety of my own research field in cognitive psychology. Back in the far less hostile field of ethnic conflict, often fogged in red mist and the occasional landmine. So I applied for a job in Gaza, traveling with the Israeli Defense Forces with the University of Israel. I was optimistic that it would be far less heartbreaking than the brokenness I had seen in the Church of England. Nevertheless, I had just tasted what Church of England clergy and missioners deal with their entire ministry life. The church is a broken place for a broken people. And when the divine pursuer opens your eyes and ears, the pain is almost unbearable. Sometimes it is like a soft, hushed lullaby at an infant's wake. And sometimes like an approaching tornado tearing up everything in its path. So how do you prepare to endure this pain and brokenness? In the Minority Anglicanism project, we were appalled at some of the hostile mail we were getting. It's easy for us to say that the church should be vulnerable and radically receptive in this hostile and difficult world, but there are consequences to this receptivity. There is a cost. For myself, I found that every 20th or 30th email we got in the project was a letter of encouragement, of gratitude and hope. They came when I most needed them, tinkling through the abuse. People offering to help, providing support, or simply telling us that they were grateful for our effort. As an academic, these shouldn't have mattered at all. They were not intellectually constructive. And as my line manager often said, they don't affect our praxis. Except they did. They were a soft chime of hope, like the songs I hear ringing from spire to spire across the country. Seemingly obscure, irrelevant, rung by sweaty human endeavor, if they're anything like our church bell ringers, very human hands huffing and puffing in a crumbling, aging bell tower. But if your hearing is more acute, it is an opus of hope ringing the good news across the country, from county to county, from spire to spire, a chorus where each note of frustration, lamentation, and jubilation mingle to ring out our songs of hope. As I said before, I'm confident that your ministries are undergirded by sound theology and compassionate spiritual exegesis. And while you have an unthanked task ahead of you, where you're misunderstood, misrepresented, taken out of context, exploited, reviled, abused, and broken over and over again, I hope you will realize that this is the breaking of your understanding and the nourishing soil of the new Eden. I hope it will open your ears to that transcendent opus that is the song of the bride of Christ. Because the secret that the divine pursuer whispers when he catches us off guard is that love can heal the lamentation, transform the despair, and transcend the brokenness, because love was stronger than death. If all else falls on deaf ears, I hope that is what you will remember most. Love is stronger than death. Thank you, and may God work through you in all your endeavors, and may you be assured that as the darkness deepens, so many of us hold you and your endeavors in our prayers.
Wow, Sanjay, thank you. I did tell you that this would be challenging, and you've certainly done that for us, Sanjay. I know there are questions coming in. Before we get to those, can I just take you right back to the beginning of your talk, Sanjay? And you talked about the importance of being at the foot of the cross. And I wonder, in the light of all you said, if you could just help us to reflect what that might mean for us as most people here are local church leaders, what that might mean for us to be at the foot of the cross.
I think one of the things that came through in the project was that the way people who evangelized, people who discipled in churches, communicated to people who are vulnerable was a sense of superiority, that the way they were being evangelized to, or the way they were being related to, didn't come from suffering. So the foot of the cross is the space of the greatest suffering, where Christ held all of the world's, all of time and space's suffering in that moment. And that's where our discipleship and evangelization needs to come from. It can't come from a place of superiority. It can't come from a place where we think, because we have been in the gift of grace, that we have something over everyone else. As Samuel said this morning, it can't come from a deficit model when you evangelize. It has to come from a celebrative asset model.
Great, thank you for that, Sanjay. I know I've seen on questions and on Twitter and other things, people really responding to what you're saying, Sanjay, and being challenged and encouraged and lots of other things. So, Tom, welcome. Have you got some questions for us?
My goodness, we have a lot of response from this, as you say, Dave, coming in across all the different platforms. Sanjay, if I may first, people are particularly highlighting the concepts such as masking difference in order to fit in, the idea of a Sunday club for elite membership. People are commenting that you're speaking truth to power, and they love that reminder that the Bible is full of broken, complicated people in difficult circumstances. So I'd like to relay the thanks that's coming in from so many of our attendees today. Turning to the research that you mentioned on a number of occasions, could you share a little bit more about that research and whether there are highlights focused just on the Church of England, or does this take into account the wider, perhaps worldwide Anglican communion?
So this is complicated because the Minority Anglicanism Project was an umbrella term, 6 different studies, and some of it built on some of the things that I did before. In some ways, it was meant to be a fairly small study for the Diocese of Birmingham, but it just escalated into something else, partly because people from across the church wrote and helped out. So when a lot of people talk about the Minority Anglicanism Project, they just mean that one quantitative study that the 42 dioceses took part, where we had a couple of thousand participants. And that itself looked at, so the question was, is race a significant othering process in the church compared to other types of othering that happens in the church? So we measured several different research questions, all nicely wrapped up in this sort of Qualtrics process, which was an intelligent design, which asked the right questions from the right people. And what we did was we compared what was happening in the Church of England across to other Anglican churches, like the Church in Wales and the Church of Ireland and the Scots. And then we compared Anglicanism in the UK to other churches in the UK, like the Roman Catholic Church and the Church of Scotland, you know, a wide variety of different churches. And our findings, which we're still currently writing up, and I have to be careful because we're not eligible to publish if we have outed the results too much before it gets to the journal. But the overall finding was that there's something in the Church of England and Anglicanism that makes race and vulnerability and a bigger issue than it does in other churches. It's a, you know, the picture is a little bit more complex than that because we're talking about a lot of questions.
Thank you so very much. We have had a few questions coming from a perspective of wanting to be not part of the problem. For instance, a white, well-educated male can come to understand that if they don't accept that they are part of the problem, they can't become part of any solution. The problem often can feel that privilege is irredeemable. So apart from merely existing and just carrying that privilege, there isn't always a clear way forward as how to become a better ally or a better part of a solution. Could you offer any thoughts to those who do not want to be part of that problem, instead want to be able to assist, be an ally, be able to help with a solution? Is there any way that you can unpack some of that, please?
That's a very, very big question. Lots of great theologians have written, you know, tomes on this, many tomes on this. I would, to simplify and caricature that into a couple of minutes answer, I would say that there's a need to give as much as receive. Our evangelization model comes from this place of power where we're giving, I use the word monological missiology a lot. I suggested Al Barrett and Ruth Harley's book on this. Monological missiology is the kind of missiology where we are only ready to speak our mind and give out and be a part of the solution, even to do, rather than be subject to receiving from the activism from the margins. So we have this model of church, which is again, which is centered, where there's a core center, whether it's a clergy person or lay leaders who are in power, that then spreads out and the teaching goes out from the middle to the edges. If you remember, the original concept of the parish, the paroikas of the early church, were boundary dwellers. There was no middle. They were the rejected. They were the people on the margins, then coming in to share how their pain and how their experiences with Christ was a part of the learning, and it was a collaborative learning community. And there's a danger that we think that those people who come to church do not, or people who are seeking Christ, do not have divine experience. And it is that, I think Sam Wells talked about this very well earlier. It is that sort of receptive model of vulnerability. And I think if we take away one learning from the gospel, it is that, the divine intervention just didn't come from a place of power. It came from absolute vulnerability. And if you look at the gospel carefully, you'll see that Jesus was interrupted by humanity many, many times over. And this is not something that we look at very often.
Sanjay, I was just wondering, as I said, most of the people here are probably local church leaders. And I think one of the questions that's probably going on in their mind, you talked about the need for leaders to listen. And I wonder if you've got any practical suggestions, maybe 2 or 3, of how people can do that in their local churches, in their local communities. What might that actually look like for someone who maybe in a way is hearing your despair but thinking, I don't know how to connect with it or respond to it?
So I'm falling into this trap of giving you practical things we can do. I think that part of this is to slow down. I'm just as bad as everyone else. It's easy when you're trying to do lots of things in the church, when you're trying to reach strategic objectives, to imagine that it's about the doing. And I think it's really about the slowing down and relating to people on a one-to-one real level. So it's not something where you can, like a tick list, attend to and then think it's done. It's something where it has to envelop your entire way of doing everything. It has to be a sort of a holistic effort, and you have to let the fact that otherness is not a factor that removes these people from what you're trying to achieve as a part of the equation. So you must sorry, let me try that again. So for example, if you were thinking about calling and who might be called in your parish to become to vocation, to ordination, instead of having a picture in your head about who might do this, it is about opening your heart and being vulnerable to who might do this. And that's really difficult because that's not how humanity operates. Very often we have an idea of who could do this, who could do the reading, who could do the, who could be on the PCC. And so the effort of being church becomes a structural organizational thing that is fed in with our prejudices. And what I'm asking for is really difficult. I'm saying, stop doing that entirely and and open your heart, even though that means that your heart is likely to be broken over and over again. Open your heart and see all of creation and all of minority ethnic people, or people of all sorts of demographics who are being othered by church, as real assets and real strengths. Listen to everything that surrounds you as a part of God's rich creation. Don't put yourself as church leaders above these. There's a danger that we misunderstand concepts of stewardship.
Great, thanks, Sanjay. I know we've got so many questions coming in, but Tom, have we got one more question before we finish?
We do. You're absolutely right, Dave. It's incredibly busy across the Q&As and the chats, and the team in the background are working wonders collating them. We've had one that's just come in, and I wanted to pose this one to you. As a church which marginalizes and others people within a society, are we a small sign of hope, or actually in a worse place than much of the society we are in?
So here's again where my mind is at war. The science, the facts tell us that actually the church, particularly because we're the state church, is a place where prejudice is the strongest at, because we have an established power. But I wouldn't be in the church if I didn't think that despite all of human efforts and all of human characteristics, making it a place that is the worst place to be if you are vulnerable. We are not church because we are humanity alone. We are not isolated in church by God. I talk about this divine dunamis all the time. It's that sort of opportunity where human vulnerability and mistakes, and you'll see this throughout the Bible, God picks that up and does marvelous things with it. So of course we are a place of hope. I wouldn't be giving my, all my time and effort into this space if I didn't think that this space was one of the greatest places of hope. And the facts might speak against it, but you can see it tinkle through. You can see it just when you think you have measured all the abuses, you have measured the real damage that the church does. You see the stories of hope and the evidence of hope tinkling through. And they're not things that can be easily quantified. And sometimes it's really difficult to tell the world that the church is a good thing. The church is not a good thing because we're doing a great job. We're doing an appalling job. The church is a wonderful thing because God is working within it, because the bride of Christ is loved, and that it is that sort of source of great hope for the world.
I was, just as we close, all you've been saying has made me reflect on those words that Paul writes, but God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, things that are not, to reduce to nothing things that are. And thank you for bringing us in a way to that place of hope, though. Thank you so much for the huge challenge that you've given us, Sanjay. And we will make available to people the works that Sanjay mentioned, and also her series Beyond the Lychgate. We'll give you the links to those so that you can follow that up. But Sanjay, thank you so much for your prophetic words to us and for your huge challenge to all of us.